Good afternoon. Hello everybody, my name is Michael Warren. I'm the BIA's Brexit lead. Welcome to our monthly Brexit webinar. I'm joined here this afternoon by myself and Georgina, who does a fantastic job of organising these webinars for us. Steve isn't with us today, so you've just got me. Steve's on his way back from the BioCentury conference in China, in Shanghai. So he sent his apologies and has asked me to fly solo for this webinar. So I hope you'll go easy on me. And also to save me just talking into the computer for the next 20 minutes or so, please do fire in some questions and comments via the webinar function that allows you to do that. Otherwise, it might sound a bit. What do you think of Georgina? It might sound a little bit dull if I just keep going for 20 minutes without any interruptions. So if you've got some thoughts and questions, the whole point about a webinar is we're supposed to try and make it interactive. We've got one polling question to get a bit of discussion going, but I'd really encourage you to just put forward your points of view on this. I'd be really interested to hear what people have got to say. So what are we going to cover today? Today, Friday, it's an interesting day, isn't it? So we've had an interesting week, Labour Party manifesto. You'll be pleased to know, of course, that we're not yet at a 4-day week at the BIA, hence we can bring you this Brexit webinar on a Friday afternoon. We're waiting for the Conservative Party manifesto. Rumours are that might appear on Sunday. So it's a busy time with lots of people looking carefully at what's happening in the election campaign. Today's webinar really just recaps on where we stand on Brexit and our thoughts about what might be coming up. So I'll just run you through the agenda in a little bit. Yeah, in terms of dates, so 20 days to the election, I think today, 3 weeks yesterday, 33 days till Christmas. Rihanna, who works here, told us today that she'd finished her Christmas shopping already, putting us all to shame. 70 days to the 31st of January, which is our next no-deal Brexit deadline. So yeah, plenty to think about. What are we going to cover this afternoon? So I thought I'd start by just a quick status update. Just, I'm sure you guys all know this, but just to kind of recap on where we stand from a Brexit point of view, where we've got to and what's happened since we last spoke. Think a little bit about that 31st of January deadline. It is a no-deal deadline. So just to recap on planning advice for that, I can give you an update on what the government's been telling us and what it's advising us as an industry to be looking at. Then we're going to go into a bit of election scenario planning, given that obviously the result of the election could have quite a significant bearing on Brexit. So I've got some thoughts on that for you. The central scenario, which we're planning for, is that the deal might be done before the end of January. So I've got some thoughts on what that might look like in terms of the negotiation phase during 2020. And then we're going to finish up hopefully with some questions and discussion. So please do have a think about what you'd like to say or what you'd like to ask as we're going through this. Good, okay, I hope that sounds okay to everyone. Let's get started on that. So the latest situation, well, it's just a bit of a recap really. So I'm sure you'll all remember, seems like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it? The PM got a new deal with the EU, got a new withdrawal agreement and political declaration. That deal got some indicative support from Parliament. It sailed through a second reading, but didn't get any further than that. Ran out of time for its 31st of October deadline. And once that deadline had passed, support for an election fell into place once no deal was off the table. The extension was agreed with the European Council. So we're now on a 31st of January extension, or earlier, of course, it's a flex extension if the withdrawal agreement is enacted before that date. So that's where we stand. So technically, if the withdrawal agreement is not ratified by the 31st of January, we'll then be back in a no-deal scenario. And of course, if there's no deal, we could get a further extension as well. And whether that deal is passed or whether there is a further extension will, of course, depend on the outcome of the general election. What else is going on? Well, plenty of thinking and commentary on what the negotiation might look like if there's a Tory government return. More on that in a bit. But kind of latest news on Brexit, we were due to submit our recommendation or nomination for an EU commissioner. The Prime Minister refused to do that, refused to nominate a new commissioner. The EU have already started, the Commission have already started legal proceedings against the EU because we have failed to comply with the legislation which says that we have to nominate a commissioner. Ursula von der Leyen, the new president-elect of the EU Commission, gave us a final deadline, which is today, 22nd of November. But it doesn't look like the UK is going to put forward a nomination. And so that legal action will proceed. I think the feeling is amongst the commentariat and the briefings coming out of Brussels is that they will continue to push ahead with that, but in the full expectation that they won't really do anything until the election, and would expect some significant movement on that at that point. So a little bit of a sideshow perhaps, although the legislation is there, we are technically in breach of it. So that's where we stand. So on the basis of all that, I thought maybe we could just kick things off in terms of a bit of interaction with our regular polling question, which those of you who join us regularly on these webinars will be very familiar with. So here it is again. I've changed the date, but the question remains the same. So what could happen on the 31st of January? And of course, I suppose I'm asking you to think about this in the context of the election as well. So that adds a little bit of extra fun to it, doesn't it? So will there be a deal by the 31st of January? Will there be no deal at that point? Or will we have a further extension? So the poll's live now, isn't it, Georgina? So fire away, everyone. Be interested in what you think. Three-quarters of people have voted. Just give it a couple of seconds for the last remaining people to have their say. Thank you very much, everyone. That's pretty much everyone in. Just give it another 3 or 4 seconds. Good. Let's finalize it there, Georgina. So, okay, interesting. I guess that's not quite what I was expecting. Was it? I don't know, really. Anyway, the results are 61% say a delay, 32% say Brexit with a deal, and 6% reckon no deal. So that's actually not too far out of line with what we've had in previous webinars, is it? So we're still at about 2/3 for a further extension, well, 3/5 on today's figures. So thanks for that. If anyone wants to drop in the comments box or the questions box why they voted, why they have, do let us know what you think. Be interested to see what people have got to say on why they think, or any comments on the results of that poll as well. If you voted for something that wasn't an extension, tell us whether you disagree with people. It'd be good to get a bit of debate going. So feel free to drop comments in at any point as we're going through this. Right, thanks. So that's the poll. I just need to move the slide back on. Oh, we have got a question here. Should we take that now, Georgina? Let's have a look. All right, I'll read it out. A couple of comments in here. One comment saying, my guess is that it'll be a hung parliament and that will create a delay. Well, yeah, that is definitely one of the scenarios that I'm planning for here, and actually you've predicted one of the slides that I've got coming up. So yeah, that's definitely one option. We've got a question here as well. Please could you clarify, assuming the UK passes the current withdrawal deal, if everything will remain the same as now in terms of drug development, interactions with EMA during the transition period? That's a very good question, and I've got a slide on that actually coming up. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to hold on that. In about 5 minutes time, I'll cover that on slide 13 of my deck. So thanks for that question. I'll come to that in a second. Okay, good. All right. Steve just noted this bit of information came into us earlier this week actually and asked me to kind of raise it on the webinar today. So this is a report from Jefferies and FTI Consulting. They had their big conference this week. Some of you may have even been or heard about it. And this is a survey they do amongst senior healthcare professionals, investors and consultants globally. And this is one of the questions, and it shows that, well, the top line is there's ongoing uncertainty. Brexit remains a critical issue for the sector. So the results of their poll of those 500 senior leaders, and asked the question, what's your view on the impacts of Brexit for the sector? We've got 2/3 anticipate Brexit having an adverse effect on the industry. And interesting, that hasn't really changed since last year. So the results from 2018 are on the left of the screen there, and it's almost identical this year. Slightly more people saying a very negative impact, but overall we're still at 2/3. So just shows that, I mean, I think that definitely reflects the feedback that we're getting from our members and from the sector more broadly. But I'd be interested in your views on this call as well, if that chimes or doesn't chime with your own opinion of Brexit and the potential impact for us as a sector. So do let us know your thoughts. Our priorities we've set out in a manifesto that we published, when was it, 2 weeks ago, I think, which we put into all of the major parties, and we're using to kind of essentially put forward our point of view. Hopefully this will get picked up, and it has in many cases, by the parties putting together their manifesto. So this is our proposal for the election, and it really is about maintaining world-class medicines regulation in a post-Brexit UK. This is one of 3 priorities that we put in our manifesto, and you'll see down the right-hand side what we've been lobbying for. So the closest possible alignment between the UK and the EU on medicines and devices regulations, whilst assisting MHRA to develop existing national flexibilities, continued participation in and cooperation with EU regulatory regimes, bodies and networks. So those of you who've been following the position that we've been put forward by as BIA over the last, well, really since the outcome of the initial referendum was called, we'll be familiar with that position. So we're continuing to push that. What else have we been doing? Well, yeah, we've been making sure that on the left-hand side, you see the list I've put together, ensuring the priorities for our sector are clear and understood by government and our stakeholders in the EU as well. So Steve's been doing a lot of work engaging with EU stakeholders too. We've been scenario planning for election outcomes, and more on that in a second. We've been talking to businesses and partners throughout the sector, both here and overseas, to find out what people think about the situation. I've been around the country, I was up in Scotland last week talking to members up there, find out people how feel about the situation. We've also been doing a bit of policy analysis on the potential implications of that new withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol that goes with it. And of course, we're continuing to engage quite closely with the Department of Health and the Office for Life Sciences, so government colleagues, both on no deal planning for 31st of January, and I'll come on to that in a second, and also kind of putting forward our priorities for any negotiation phase. So just to recap on what we've got on that then. So no deal 31st of January is still a technical possibility. An interesting 6% of you in that poll we just ran thought that that was likely to happen. So yeah, no deal is definitely still possible. So both the government and we are advising that you continue in your no deal preparations, those of you who've undertaken that work. To help you with that, we've got our back catalogue of webinars, which contain expert and opinion and discussion covering the big issues. So we've got one on continuity to supply, one on regulations, there's one on commercial considerations, trade and customs, and one on people, immigration and employment matters. So those are all available on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and recap on advice on those issues. Our Brexit portal, which we set up, has links to all of the no deal guidance, the latest links to government information, and links to those webinar recordings and resources. So you can access all that via biabrexit.org if you want. The advice from government remains the same, so I'm just going to recap on that on this slide. You may recall that they set up a dedicated support unit for our sector, so a dedicated resource for life sciences businesses and industry. That's an email, well, a team that can be accessed via email at btradeready@dhsc.gov.uk. That team is still in place and will remain operational throughout the extension period, so until the 31st of January. So if anyone does have any inquiries or questions about preparations on any aspect of Brexit readiness, you can contact those guys directly for specific questions, or of course you can talk to us at BIA as well. We'll be happy to help. The government's advising or asking industry to continue to maintain buffer stocks. So stockpiling that ultimately has been in place for some time now. So initially stockpiling was asked for, 6-week stockpiles were asked for the 31st of March deadline last year. They asked us to hold those over for 31st of October, and they're now asking us to hold them over again for 31st of January. We recognise that's a significant burden for us as an industry, but it does remain a kind of a cornerstone of the readiness plan. So the government is asking us to maintain every effort to keep that in place. They've got the extra warehousing space for stockpiling medicines if people need it. That is continue to be available at market rates. And if you want to access that, you can do that by contacting that trader readiness unit. They've also continued to keep live the contracts for the government freight services and the express freight services that were available for 31st of October. So those will be available from 31st of January if the EU leaves without a deal. And if you want to pre-register for those, you can still do that. You should have been sent a link if you hold a license for a medicine or a product. If you don't have a link to register for that, you can contact the Be Trader Ready team and they will give you one if you need it. And if you've already registered for those services, the codes that you have been given will still be valid for the 31st of January. Just advice there that government is asking for you to make sure that your hauliers or your freight suppliers are already registered as well, so that ultimately the trucks can get on the lorries or whatever. You'll also recall that the government passed a number of statutory instruments covering regulations to enable MHRA to take on a role as a national regulator in the event that we leave without a deal. And those are still in place for the 31st of January if necessary. And lastly, the National Supply Disruption Response for medicines was stood up for 31st of October. That's been now put back to cooperating hours, but will be stood up again if necessary in the run-up to the 31st of January deadline if we don't have a deal at that point. So that's the government's picture. Hopefully that's helpful. Just as a recap, those are the broad points of guidance for getting ready for that 31st of January deadline. Good. Do fire in any questions on any of that if you need to as we're going through the rest of this. So the next section I wanted to cover was looking ahead to scenarios. So one of the questions we had earlier talked about one of those scenarios. So let's have a look. So here we go. Here are the election scenarios. So starting at the top, the first scenario, and the one that polling analysis and spread betting certainly suggests is the most likely scenario as we stand today, of course everything could change over the next 3 weeks, is a Conservative majority. So that's the first scenario. So in the event that there is a Conservative majority government, the Prime Minister has committed to bringing back his deal. If there's a Conservative majority, all Conservative candidates are signed up to that deal, and therefore we fully expect that the deal would pass with a majority in Parliament, and that would be done before the 31st of January. That deal then has to be ratified by the European Parliament, which is an extra hurdle, but I don't think we see that as being an insurmountable hurdle. Guy Verhofstadt has said that there are some issues in his view with the protections for EU citizens within the withdrawal agreement, which may or may not provide a little bit of further consideration at the Parliament end of things, but I don't really see that that's going to derail passing the deal through both the EU and the UK Parliaments by the 31st of January. So at that point, we'd enter the transition period, which is prescribed within the withdrawal agreement, and the UK government would enter into discussions with the EU on the future relationship, the future free trade agreement negotiations. So that's scenario one, and more on that transition period in a minute, but just let's look at the other scenarios. So scenario two is a Labour Party majority, or perhaps more likely looking at the polling, a Labour SNP partnership. whether that would be a formal coalition or some sort of a parliamentary arrangement. And it could potentially extend beyond the Labour and the SNP to other minor parties as well. In the event that that happens, both the Labour Party and the SNP are committed to renegotiating a deal with the European Union and putting the results of that deal to a second referendum. In order to do that, there would have to be a further extension. So we're looking at an extension beyond the 31st of January. The Labour Party have said that they would take 3 months to renegotiate a deal and then a further 3 months beyond that to hold a second referendum. The SNP's policy is giving the UK public another say on Brexit, so they're committed to the second referendum. So that's scenario 2. The third scenario is a hung parliament, where the Conservative Party would have the most seats but would not have a majority. In that event, it's clear that it's unlikely the deal would not be passed, not least because whilst with the previous withdrawal agreement, so before Parliament was prorogued, dissolved for this election, you'll remember that some Labour Party MPs, pro-Brexit MPs, voted for the PM's deal. That's not really likely to happen next time round, given the manifesto positions of the main parties. So it's more than likely that the deal wouldn't pass. And because the Prime Minister has already explicitly ruled out a no deal, that necessarily means that there would have to be a further extension. Now, what happens in that scenario is not easy to predict, but it seems very, very likely that therefore we would have to have a second general election or some sort of compromise, which would lead to a second referendum. So that's the third scenario, by far the most uncertain of the three, but probably more likely to lead us back to the same result of the second scenario, if that makes sense. But again, I'd be interested in people's views on that, if you want to fire in a question or a comment. So that's how we see it here. So let's just have a look then at the central planning assumption at this stage, which is that the Conservatives come back with a majority and we proceed with their deal. And so I've just sketched out here a hypothetical timeline, which is really based on the premise, the hypothesis that that deal gets through by the 31st of January. And we're looking at the Prime Minister's stated aim to negotiate a future partnership with the EU by the 31st of December 2020. Plenty of debate around that, so we'll come to that issue in a second about whether that can be done. But here's the kind of the timeline based on that hypothesis. So starting on the left, so we've got the UK election later in December, followed by a Queen's speech, followed by a vote on the withdrawal agreement, and followed by a European Parliament vote on the withdrawal agreement. As I said earlier, that's all likely to happen reasonably smoothly, I think, in the event of a Tory majority by 31st of January. And so we would enter into a Brexit transition period as prescribed in the withdrawal agreement. So the arrow goes up, and that's because the first thing that happens as part of that transition period is that the UK and the European Commission negotiating team would have to produce their negotiating mandates. And once they've got their mandates together, they can enter into negotiations. And those would go on throughout the spring. The first sort of milestone is the 1st of July, which is the date prescribed in the withdrawal agreement, the point at which, if there's going to be a further extension beyond the end of the year, the 31st of December, that would have to be decided on in terms of the withdrawal agreement provisions by the 1st of July. So that's our first major milestone. If we assume that no extension is agreed at that point, which seems unlikely given the Prime Minister's stated ruling out of an extension beyond the end of December, then further negotiations, some sort of indicative draft deal, free trade agreement, future partnership agreed, and then begins quite a complex procedure whereby the EU Commission, Parliament and Member States would all have to ratify that deal. It's one box on this timeline, but it is actually quite an elaborate process, and more on that in a second. But theoretically, that could be done and the future partnership would be into operation by the end of the year. And then would probably begin some sort of phased implementation period depending on the terms of the deal that was done. That's at this stage pretty unclear, but advice is that from commentators and experts that it would be likely that we'd have some further implementation period in order to enact that deal. So there's the kind of the hypothesis if you kind of take the Prime Minister's perspective on this. And what would happen during the transition period? So the question we had earlier on was, if we enter a transition, what happens to things like regulations and the position in terms of our sector and ongoing relationship between the MHRA and the EMA? So during the transition period, I think we might have used this slide in a previous webinar anyway. So in the transition period, the Medicines and Devices Regulation would stay aligned with the EU. So not much changes from that point of view. So if we just look at the box on the right-hand side, during transition, firms could continue, businesses continue to do UK batch release and testing, batch release, QP certification from the UK, marketing authorization holders, qualified persons and QPPVs who continue to be based in the UK. License holders and inspections would continue to be recognised. CE marking continues to be used and recognised. Notified bodies can continue to conduct conformity assessments. UK continues to be treated as a member state for the purposes of mutual recognition agreements and for the legislation, and licenses for caps would still be valid in the EU and UK. So all pretty much in a standstill position. The big change is that under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the MHRA would be out of the European regulatory network. At the EU's discretion, they would continue to access all EU databases and would have potentially the ability to attend EMA committee meetings, but by invitation where there's a UK interest. So that's the position during transition. So from an industry perspective, from a business perspective, not much change. Quite a big change from the MRHA's perspective, though, and our ability to influence on future regulatory decisions. Any questions on that, please do fire them in. So as you'll have seen previously, and as I noted before in relation to our kind of BIA manifesto on this, we have been pushing the government for some time, it's a considerable period of time, on the importance of maintaining close cooperation with the EU on regulation. The government has accepted that, and the new political declaration you'll have seen does set a direction, a destination for a free trade agreement which includes regulatory collaboration, and the government's keen and has accepted the importance of active participation with the EMA, and that was reconfirmed by Matt Hancock, Secretary of State for Health, when he turned up at our Bioscience Forum a few weeks ago. Clearly that would be subject to the negotiations with the EU about the terms of the future partnership and the free trade agreement. But the government has accepted, and that is the government's position. It's what we often refer to as Plan A. We have been successful, and the government has recognised the importance of that position. So that's the position that we expect will be taken into the negotiation phase. Okay, so just when we're looking at the timeline before, I was just talking about that being hypothetical. Clearly there is a huge amount of debate you will have seen about the viability of that timeline. So the question is, can a deal be done by the end of 2020? Well, the Prime Minister, you know, in his own way has said there's bags of time to wrap up negotiations for a comprehensive new trade deal, and he is not countenancing extension beyond the end of next year. In terms of getting into that transition period and the beginning of the negotiations, assuming the withdrawal agreement is passed, well, the EU, for its own part, believes that if the UK leaves by the 31st of January, it would be able to finalise its own negotiating mandate within 4 weeks. So the negotiations could begin on March the 1st. You might have heard Phil Hogan, the EU Trade Commissioner designate, saying ready to go by St. Patrick's Day. His view was that we're not starting from zero, and so with a bit of goodwill on both sides, we can do an agreement more quickly than we would any other negotiations around the world, which would take 3 or 4 years. However, the EU does have a pretty elaborate process for negotiating trade deals. It's a 33-stage process, and it is actually, there's guidance set out, which I've got a picture of on the right-hand side there. You can find it on the Commission's website. An elaborate and quite complicated process of consultation about the likely impact of a deal. And of course, that point I made before about the final deal having to be ratified in each member state and regional parliament, and that means that each of those individual member states and regional parliaments would have a veto over the terms of any final deal. So complicated, fraught with risk, and hugely complex. Just some more quotes on this. So Leo Varadkar, Arish Tishik at the bottom there in the middle, if the new FTA is very close to the status quo, then it will be negotiated very quickly. The more the UK chooses to diverge from the status quo, the longer it's going to take. And then Sabine Weyand, the EU's DG for Trade, said a thin bare bones deal, this was in a briefing she gave to The Sun, a thin bare bones deal or a hard Brexit from the transition period without any deal. So you'll have seen this. There's a considerable degree of skepticism. There is, however, the final bullet at the top there, potential to provisionally apply parts of an agreement, which means the deal could come into effect pending a full ratification process. So this is the idea of bilateral or sector-specific mini deals done on a rolling timescale. So all of that is possible, but it looks pretty complicated. For the EU's part, they are focused heavily on this idea, you'll have heard of the terminology here, the level playing field. So Michel Barnier is transitioning from his role of the Brexit negotiator into head up a newly formed UK task force, to rebuild the future relationship. So he's going to be heading up the trade talks teams, working closely with commissioners leading the various aspects that will form part of that future partnership, future relationship, covering issues such as judicial affairs, defence, foreign policy, in addition to the free trade agreement. Now, the political declaration that accompanies the withdrawal agreement already commits both sides to seeking a zero tariff, zero quota FTA. But of course, it's not as simple as that, is it? Because the UK could face formidable regulatory barriers, non-tariff barriers, and limits, for instance, to access for the services sector. Michel Barnier has already stressed that tariff and quota-free access to the EU are linked to maintaining that level playing field. Some quotes from him here at the bottom. Access to our markets will be proportional to the commitments taken to the common rules. The agreement we're ready to discuss is zero tariff, zero quota, zero dumping. And the UK should not think that zero tariff, zero quotas will be enough. I've just done a little graphic here on the right, which kind of hopefully brings that to life in a very simplistic way. So in a sense, we're starting kind of top left, in the sense that as we exit the EU, we have full access to the EU single market, and we are fully aligned to EU rules and legal oversight. If we reduce our alignment to EU rules and legal oversight, then in terms of Michel Barnier's position and the EU's position, that will necessarily mean reduced access to the EU single market. So it's a sort of a direct kind of linear correlation that you're putting forward there. So that's the scenario that we're facing. Other considerations for that future relationship? I mean, there are many of them. Here I've pulled out 4 for us. The first relates to regulation, obviously a key area for us in medicines and healthcare and life sciences. So this is just a quote from Sam Lowe, who's an expert on European policy at the Centre for European Reform. I'll just read it out. An FTA is unlikely to allow UK regulators to continue to sign off highly regulated products looking to be placed on the EU market. This will require British producers to seek regulatory approval within the EU as well as the UK. So that really brings home that point that according to existing EU positions and the stance they've taken in other trade negotiations with other countries around the world, and the language emerging already from the negotiating team on the EU side, there's a high threshold there which we're going to have to look at from the UK side heading into those negotiations. The second consideration, time pressure. I've said already there's this kind of deadline of the 1st of July hardwired into the withdrawal agreement on whether to extend the transition period. Now, actually, there's nothing to stop, by mutual agreement, the UK and the EU agreeing a further extension beyond the 31st of December 2020 at any point up to the 31st of December 2020. So whilst that is hardwired into the withdrawal agreement, I mean, in practical terms, they could wait for a later point before deciding to extend if they both agreed to it. It's just that 1st of July is the substantive point by which one or other of the parties, EU or UK, could decide to extend. The third area is money. This is a big political consideration, potentially, because the £39 billion exit bill that is part of the withdrawal agreement, the draft withdrawal agreement, relates only to a full exit by December 2020. So any further extension beyond that point would involve renegotiating a further exit bill. And that obviously would be hugely politically difficult in the event that this government gets returned, given what the Prime Minister has already said about that matter. And then the last area is services. So I mentioned earlier that non-tariff issues are going to be a considerable issue to pick up in the negotiation phase, because ultimately a free trade agreement is only really going to apply substantively to goods. Services, I'm sure many of you will know, and recognition of things like professional qualifications are currently handled at a member state level within the EU. So professional qualifications acceptance is delegated to member states. And that means we could potentially be looking at negotiating that on a bilateral basis with each EU member state, in addition to the main negotiations around a free trade agreement. So that's an additional complexity for those businesses in the life sciences sector providing services to European businesses. Okay, I'm just going to recap on our position again, position we've agreed with the ABPI as well. And that's just to say that notwithstanding all of those considerations, we will be pushing for the UK government to be clear in its negotiating mandate that we're looking for maximum alignment. We want an agreement, a future partnership, a free trade agreement to be on the basis of sector-specific annexes or protocols. So we want something bespoke for the life sciences sector, if necessary on a different timeline. The government should prioritise maximum alignment on pharmaceutical legislation, while still allowing the UK to adopt new legislation, so freedom for the MHRA where possible, continued participation and cooperation within the regulatory regimes, bodies and networks, a level playing field so that we don't face any barriers, protection of IP rights, smooth and early access to medicinal products, to make sure that we've got the highest possible level of public health protection and the maximum possible availability of new treatments for UK and EU citizens. So that's what we're going to continue to argue for if we enter that phase. Remember, it's all hypothetical at this stage and dependent on the results of the election. Okay, hope that's clear. I'm sure some of you will have questions on that, so please do throw them in. I'll come back to that in a second. Just to finish up with, just a couple of things coming up that I wanted to flag to you. So we've got another one of our Brexit Lead network meetings, and this is a jointly hosted meeting between ABPI and BIA for our members, which is scheduled for the 17th of December, 10 to 11 a.m. That's being done as a webinar. So for those of you on the call today who are ABPI or BIA members, please do sign up for that. Details on both of our websites. And then just a final word from me before we go to questions, to say we'd really welcome your feedback on any of these issues. So please do continue to email us with your comments, questions and views. There's our inbox, biabrexit@bioindustry.org. We're ready to listen. And we will be continuing to engage with government once they get through the election, and we'll be expecting, if this government is returned, to have a substantial input into the negotiating mandates that will be put forward and taken into those free trade and future partnership discussions with the EU. So it would be great to have your views on that. Okay, great. That's it in terms of slides. My next one simply says, does anyone have any questions or comments on any of all of that? Okay. All right, well, thanks to those of you who sent questions already. I'm just going to recap to make sure I've answered the ones that came in earlier. So could we clarify if everything will remain the same as now if the withdrawal agreement is passed in terms of drug development processes, interactions with EMA during the transition period? Just to recap on that, from an industry perspective, no difference. Interactions with the EMA, MHRA's position does change because they have to be invited by the EMA to participate in meetings, and that will be observer status only. So it does change from a participation point of view, but in terms of things like testing, release, authorizations, no change from a business perspective. Here's another question. What are the expectations for a free trade agreement? I thought it was anything between 5 and 9 years. Well, exactly. So, I mean, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you can look at all of the comments that people have made, and we can look at the evidence that of how long it's taken for the EU to do deals with other countries. You know, there's the CETA deal with Canada, etc. These things have traditionally taken years to do. That point has been put to the Prime Minister many times, and the government's response to that, of course, is that because we're negotiating from the position of starting from the position of full alignment, it's going to be a lot easier. Many people, commentators and experts who are familiar with EU legislation and this issue have said that that doesn't necessarily make it any easier, not least because negotiating from the point of view of starting from full alignment has never been done before. So there's well, I think you're right, there's a considerable amount of skepticism about that. I think from our point of view, clearly as an industry, certainty is a good thing. We would want any negotiation to be resolved as quickly as possible, and that's why you've seen from our position and API's position, we're looking, if necessary, for the UK to put in place a specific arrangement for the life sciences sector based on the current full alignment and full participation arrangements that we have in place. And I think it has been accepted that some provisions of that FTA would take longer than others. And you know, the central point is the further that the government would seek to diverge from the current arrangements, the further greater freedoms that they would want in that arrangement, the longer it's likely to take. So, sorry, that's a very long-winded way of saying I completely agree. And how long it might take in practice is not clear. It's an impossible thing to answer because we don't know what the government is going to be asking for in those negotiations. We're pretty clear what the government's going to be asking for from our sector's point of view because they have committed to full alignment. But that's obviously only one part of a very, very broad set of negotiations covering a huge range of issues with great complexity across the breadth of the economy and a range of other issues. So we don't know until we know what that negotiating mandate looks like from a government point of view. We can't possibly really know how long it's going to take in totality. Sorry, I hope that's helpful. And I'm sorry I couldn't be clearer, but hopefully I'll be clear about the reasons why I can't be. If anyone's particularly interested in following up on that, do ping me an email via the BIA Brexit inbox, or give us a call here and I'd happily have a chat about it and maybe point you at some sources of expert views on this, of which there is much debate going on at the moment. Good. Any other questions, Georgina? Nothing else coming in? Okay, great. Well, I hope that was helpful. Georgina, what did you think?
Yeah, it was great. Very interesting as always.
Good stuff. Sorry you only had me to listen to. Steve's back on Monday, and I'm sure we'll be on the line for our next Brexit webinar in due course. Until then, as I say, keep the questions and comments flowing in. And I'll just say to conclude, thank you very much for listening and dialing in on a Friday afternoon. And yeah, talk to you all soon. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.